what can we talk about here that will forward the action? You know, one of my teachers used to use that phrase. What will forward the action? If you use that as a way of paying attention to what you say, right, you'll train yourself to stop wasting energy. You know, what will forward the action? So it means let's not just talk about, you know, let's just not talk about complaining or interesting subjects or sharing current events. No, let's have a purposeful conversation. Let's have a conscious conversation. Let's focus and really look with laser clarity at where we are. This is what the training. This is what you're training yourself to do. If you're involved in this process, you're training yourself to stay aware of where you are. Where am I? Where am I in relationship to life? In relationship to the circumstances that I have right now in my life? In relationship to my body? In relationship to my family? In relationship to my life in the past and the future? There's all kinds of ways that we're related, right? Related to money, related to your body, related to your family, related to the country, related to the world. Obviously, relationships have been coming up recently in terms of giving relationships some attention, some conversation. And it's an important subject because in the condition that we find ourselves in as being identified as a personality and a physical body, that identification as a personality and a physical body is an identification of a separate self. And once there's a separate self, then relationship exists, right? Until we're separate from one another, right, there's no relationship. Once we're separate from one another, then we can be related to one another. Well, but the interesting thing about that is that in this work we're doing, in meditation and in these teachings, what are we learning and practicing? We're learning that we're not separate selves. And we're practicing experience, not being a separate self. So then what happens to relationship then? Well, what happens to relationship is that even though the experiences of not being a separate self, and the experience, as we were talking about earlier, is one of common consciousness, collective consciousness. That's the experience of consciousness, is collective consciousness. We're not separate. But in this world of time and space, where we're playing the human game, you know, where we're operating in this story of life that we're all involved with, in that we have separate selves. In that we're playing roles. In that we each have a script in this drama, in this play that we're involved with, right? So it's an interesting paradox, isn't it? On the one hand, you're not separate. On the other hand, you're separate. However, if you're just oriented with being separate, and all your behavior comes just from being separate, which means your behavior will be survival oriented, because if you're separate, you got to take care of yourself, right? So if that's all there is, then you're living a life that's going to involve suffering, and living a life that's going to involve conflict, and living a life that's going to involve depression and anxiety and anger. You know, that's the human experience when you're a separate self, right? Because inevitably, if you're in the world as a separate self, even if you're a nice person, there are other people that ain't so nice. There are other people that have concluded that the way to be in this world is to kill or be killed. You know, there are people walking around that are living with that way of being, kill or be killed, right? That's the person that if you look at them too long, they will say, what are you looking at? Right? They're conflict waiting to have an excuse to be upset, you know, or anger waiting to have somebody to be angry with, like that, right? Yeah, that's a person who's operating from this ideology of I didn't ask to be here, so don't mess with me. Life sucks and then you die, so don't mess with me, right? We see that in the world, right? And we don't know, you walk around in the world, you don't know what's going on in somebody else's head. You don't know what's going on with them emotionally. You don't know how they're operating. You don't know their mental health, right? That's one of the things that's very important to understand if you're awake, one of the things to be aware of, right, is other people, and to pay attention so that you can detect when somebody is really way off, so that you can, stay away from that person, right? That's good to have radar like that, because it is true that in the world we live in, it's not the world of a collective consciousness, no. Even though that's the truth, it's a world of people who are living in a delusion about reality, considering themselves to be separate, considering themselves to feel threatened about being separate. Yeah, and then if you're a teenager and you're already insecure and you've had a harsh upbringing, you don't have a good family life, you don't have a good self-image, right? And so you may be a little bit off in terms of the way you're thinking. And if you isolate yourself and start getting into these neurotic states or worse, right, you could end up being dangerous. And the reality of it is, the truth be told, in any population, there are going to be people like that. Just statistically speaking, there are going to be people like that are dangerous. So the more awake you are, the more aware you are, the more able you are to detect that energy and to not get into direct confrontation with that type of person. Can you be there with a sense of appropriateness? And what I mean by that is sometimes it's appropriate to be angry. Sometimes it's appropriate to withdraw from a situation, right? So can you be there in a way where you can be aware of what's called for? See, that's the thing. That's the thing. What we're up to here is to be free from being limited in terms of our ability to respond, a limited ability to respond, or a limited number of ways we can respond. That would be a personality, right? That's a conditioned personality, right? Yeah, so what we're talking about here is getting free from that limitation, from that conditioning. And if I am free from that limitation and that conditioning, it means I have available to me all possible options. All possibilities are available. So in relationship to a person, right, if I can stay in the awareness, of course, that's what we're practicing all the time, right? If I can experience myself as the awareness, as I am being in relationship to another, that awareness will give me the freedom to see how to be with them, what to say, what to do, in terms of paying attention, being aware. But you see, that's the thing that awareness gives us, that's an added feature. First of all, it's not limited by the personality. It's not limited by the conditioning. And most of the time, most people in the ordinary way that they operate, they're paying attention to out there. All the attention is out there. And the machinery over here is running in relationship to how to relate to out there, how to act to out there, right? But for most people, their attention is completely out there. And the awareness they have of what's going on over here in thinking and feeling and sensations is not connected to what's going on out there. So what I mean by that, for example, is because of that, the interpretation of what's happening gets distorted. I'm not angry, you're making me angry. That's the distortion. You're confusing me, you're making me angry, you're messing with me, you're ruining my life, as a matter of fact, right? That's the distortion, right? When you're unaware of this side of the action, it looks like everything's happening from there, and you're at the effect of it all. When you see it and you include this side of the action, it's not so much the case that you're at the effect of it all. In fact, when you see it from this side with clarity and awareness and an understanding given by that clarity and the wisdom that's available to you, right? You realize that the truth is you're responsible for the whole thing. The truth is that when you're angry, you got angry. Nobody made that happen with you, right? your interpretation of what happened had you be triggered. And once you were triggered, your system produced anger. It didn't get produced from outside of you, okay? So when you see these kinds of things, you understand, right, that I need to be willing to take responsibility for my life. I need to be willing to take responsibility for what's going on here emotionally, my conditioning. I need to take responsibility for the thought process that's occurring here. And if I'm awake and I can look at it not from within the system, but if I can look at it from outside the system and see how this is playing, and then also have the awareness to see what's happening in the world, right? I can then start to see if it's a mismatch. I can start to see, wait a minute, I'm feeling this, I'm thinking this, I have these physical sensations, the other person's saying this and doing this, right? I can see the whole thing, 360, right? I can see the whole thing. And because I can see the whole thing, I can also see if I do what my thoughts are telling me to do, is that likely to work? Is that likely to work? And most of the time, it's not that hard to answer the question because everything is a pattern. So the real question is, if I do what I always do, if I do what I have done in the past in this situation like this, is it likely to work? Well, the answer to that, if you're coming from identifying with your personality, the answer for that is probably not. Probably not, because what you did in the past was defensive or aggressive, it was coming from that survival modality, right? And what works is not to come from survival. What works is to come from awareness, to come from clarity, to come from compassion, to come from caring, to come from being established in such a way that you don't feel threatened. When you're established with your true awareness, when you're established with your actual nature, there's no threat. You don't feel threatened. Or if there is a threat, right, you don't identify with it. If there is a threat, you don't feel that threat is something that is necessarily a function of what's going to happen to you. It may be a function of your perception. It may be a function of the way you're interpreting the situation. But regardless of that, as you continue to practice this, the summary statement at the beginning of the Course in Miracles starts to become alive. What is real cannot be threatened. If you're being who you really are, you cannot be threatened. And if you're being who you really are and you're experiencing being who you really are, the experience that you're having is that you're not being threatened. And if you're not being threatened, then you have the ability to respond differently. If you feel like you're being threatened, right, then your emotions start to take over. They start to determine the way your mind's working and the thoughts that you're having. And if that's all you got, and that's where you come from, good luck. Even though you have been practicing all these years being a person, right, being a personality, nonetheless, the truth remains the truth. It's not real. It's not real. And when you stop identifying with it, right, the problem's over. When you stop identifying with the personality, the problem's over. Because if you're clear the personality doesn't actually exist, right? Now you can get that conceptually, can't you? By now you should have gotten that conceptually, right? Yeah. So if you get it conceptually, the next step is to get the experience of it, right? That's literally waking up. To get the experience of it. Well, when you get what's not real handled, what's left is what's real. When you know what you're not, what's there when you're not identified as that is what's real, right? You can up to a point, but then you hit the paradox, like I was saying before. Like one of the paradoxes is when you're not here, I mean, if you really look at this, it's actually true. When you're not here, and when I say you're not here, the you that you consider yourself to be, the you that you ordinarily are, right? When that's not here, when you're not here, you're here. You're here. Because when that's not here, you're not pretending to be something you're not. When that's not here, you're not acting as if you're a person. No, you know that's not real. So when you know that's not real, what is here now is real. When you're not trying to be something you're not, you are what you are. You don't have to try and be that. That's already true. That's a big discovery. You see, when you have what they call Kensho, what I mentioned here, Satori, the awakening, all that, right? That experience that everybody talks about, right? When you have that, What's happening is you're literally letting go of identifying with what you're not. That's what's happening. You're literally letting go of identifying what you're not. So it's not a shift from one thing to another. No, it's not a shift from one thing to another. It's the waking up from a delusion. It's the waking up from an illusion that there was something there that you have to shift from that to something else. That's an illusion. There's nothing there. That's why nothing has to happen for you to be what you are, because you already are. So there is no way to be that is the right way to be. There is no strategy that is a strategy that works. No such thing. The only thing that works is to be present and free from all that, to see what's happening, and then once you see what's happening, right, have access to your true nature, which involves wisdom and unlimited intelligence, and let that come into the situation. What do I mean by that? I mean, if you're being who you are, the thoughts that will occur when you're being who you are will come from who you are, like wisdom, like intelligence, right? When you're being who you're not, the thoughts that are coming and the emotions that are coming from your conditioning. And that's all survival. That's all survival orientation. Your conditioning, the primary function of your conditioning is survival. So when that's where you're coming from, that's going to trump everything else. You're going to make sure you survive the situation, no matter what. No matter what. Even if that means that you have to say and do things that will cause the other person to be terrified or hate your guts or never want to talk to you again. You'll do what you do at that time automatically, totally, without any control over doing it. That's a person. That's a personality. That's a reactive person. That's a person that's coming from their conditioning. And you see it all over the place, right? You see it all over the place. When you look at the typical dynamic of a family, most people don't want anybody looking at the dynamic of their family. But if you look at the typical dynamic of a family, it's people surviving with each other. Even within the family, you know? You threaten somebody, I don't care if you're married to them. I don't care if they're your parents. You start behaving in a way that makes them feel threatened, and the game's on. Doesn't matter. They can't help themselves. They could. If they could help themselves, they would, because it doesn't go well. It doesn't turn out well. You know, when you get crazy, when you're angry and you get crazy and you start being abusive, you start cursing people out, you start calling names, or worse, or you get passive aggressive. That's one of the worst conditions, passive aggression, because then you can be aggressive and deny it. You know, oh, I'm not angry. And usually, what's actually going on here, when you see more of the reality of it, is that your emotions, the emotions usually have taken over, and the emotions are causing the behavior of the people. So they're just emotions bouncing off each other. You know, bouncing off. And if they add to those emotions a speech, you know, then it's angry talk and emotional energy just bouncing around, bouncing back and forth, and it's all hurtful. Everybody gets hurt, everybody's upset, everybody's angry, and nobody knows how to fix it. There is no that's what I'm trying to say. There's no pat answer to any of these things, right? So it's not a question of like, can I find the right answer? Right? No, you can't find the right answer because there is no right answer. It could be that the way you're dealing with it could be workable if you're okay with that. Well, you know, the solution that's consistent with the possibility of realizing your true nature, right? Because don't forget, your true nature is always completely okay about everything. Your true nature is never resists what's happening, never is in opposition to what's happening, is not struggling with it. No. So another way to deal with this is to use your relationship with this person as a practice. So when you're with them, practice noticing when you're rejecting what's happening. It's not even about them. Notice when you're rejecting what's happening. See if you could practice allowing them to be the way they are. See, that's the key to all this, right? Is what we become interested in, what we're paying attention to is workability. That's not always easy. That's not always comfortable, right? To be honest with people, right? But it works. It works. In the end, that's what we're after, is workability, whether we're talking about your own personal life or the way you're relating to other people. Find what will work. The workability is always a possibility. That's an important thing to know. Workability is always a possibility. You can always discover a way to have things work. It must be possible because who we are allows everything to be the way it is. If that's the case, there must be a possibility of workability in any situation, right? It falls out of that. But that's the thing, that's why we're here, is because what this work and these practices have to offer is the possibility of workability, the possibility of happiness, the possibility of peace, right? And if that's possible, you have to be awake to see what's possible. You have to be awake to see it. And one of the things that is part of this process in the very beginning is accepting the fact that you're not awake. You can't wake up until you realize you're not awake. What does that mean? Not being awake means that you're living in a thought process. That's what not being awake. When you have a problem, you try and figure out the solution. That's not being awake. That's living in a thought process. The workability in the world doesn't live in your head. The workability in the world lives in the possibilities that are out there to be seen if you're awake to notice those possibilities. You'll see, if you stay with this work and you keep at it, right, over time, you'll start to see that you can see possibilities. You can see possibilities you didn't see before when you were being pea-shooter or brain. When you were being dominated by your emotions, when you were being dominated by your thought process. You couldn't see possibilities because as far as you were concerned, whatever was possible was something that you could think about. Or whatever was possible was something that you could feel about. But that's not true. What's possible is beyond what you think. What's possible is beyond how you feel. And if you want to have access to that, you have to be aware of the limitations of thinking and the limitations of identifying with thinking and identifying with your emotions, and practice being aware in such a way where you can see what's happening, like what's possible, not just what you think or what you feel, or what your interpretation is of the situation. And if you keep doing this work, that will begin to reveal itself to you. You'll begin to notice that the way everything is occurring differently. There's more there than you saw before. Even in terms of your everyday, ordinary experience. I mean, one of the things that is very clear to me, after awakening, the world is not the same world. After awakening, colors are much more intense. After awakening, when I walk around, I see much more than I was seeing before when I was walking around. I think I mentioned this before. I've been around for a while now on the planet. I've seen those things, just like you have. I've seen those things all over the place, right? But I never really saw them. They were there, but I never really saw them. And after awakening, I saw a tree for the first time, and it was like, whoa, what is that? What is that? And they're all over the place. They're really the exterior lungs for human beings. Do you ever think of that? Because they have the opposite breath effect that we have. They breathe out what we breathe in.
That's why it's so sad.
Yeah, well, that's what happens when you are sleeping through your life. So, the emphasis of all of these things keep coming back to the same thing. No matter what it is that's not working, come back to the initial issue, and that is the problem. And the initial issue is the confusion about who you are. Confusion about who you are. As soon as you wake up to the truth of yourself, you also wake up to the truth of the world. When you see yourself clearly, you see life clearly. When you see yourself clearly, you see the world clearly. And when you have clarity, right, you have access to the possibilities that exist. And then being happy and having peace of mind and being effective in the way you live your life starts to become natural. That's the best part of all this. It becomes natural. It's not a job. It's not something you have to struggle with. It's not something you have to work hard at. No, it becomes natural. You're just there. You're just there seeing things as they are and interacting with that. That's all. That's all. Very easy and very simple. It's very hard to accept that it's that simple. That's the difficulty with all this. You know, who you are is so hard to accept because it's so obvious you can't see it. It's frustrating, right? Who you are is so hard to be and accept because you can't see it, and it's frustrating, especially when it's important for you to see it. You can't see it. Why? Because your habit is to pay attention to what you're not. That's your habit. You pay attention to what you think, and part of what you think is to think who you are. So if you're dependent on thinking, right, that thinking generates who you are. And once that's generated, you're limited to being very small personality with a limited conditioned background. And that's where your life comes from. That's who you're being. That's where your behavior comes from. That's where your life comes from. That's where the quality of your life exists. So if you get that handled, right, if you see it for what it is, nothing has to change, because that which you thought you were, you never were. Nothing has to change. Just like Paul Hederman says, I love it when he says, you don't have to get out of this situation you're in. You don't have to get out of being a personality. You know why? Because you were never in it. You were never in it. And the first thing the personality does with that information when it first hears it is, oh, I'm going to work hard to get out of this. That'll guarantee that you stay in it. Because you're working to get out of being a personality as a personality. It's much easier than that. All you have to do is see what's real. And when you see what's real, the personality is obviously not real. So all you have to do is stop being that. Stop being it. All right. Enough said, I hope.